So we're ready to start drawing a box from life, and I've got a photograph of the box that's out in front of me so that you can see the same view that I'm seeing, and I'm going to talk you through how I might start a drawing. So the very first thing you might do is just try to establish, without even doing much measuring, just sort of a really loose kind of gestural suggestion of what the box might be so that you have an idea of how big it needs to be on your page. And there's so many angles here that I'm not beginning to think that I have any of these anywhere close to being right. But the main thing is just to kind of establish the scale of the drawing. And then what I do is I try to find one unit that I can be referring to over and over again. Hopefully you'll choose a part that is either a true vertical or a part that's not being obscured by any other thing. Like you don't want a measurement that has a flap in front of it or that you can't really see the full edge of that. So in this particular box, I'm going to choose this front corner of the box, and I'd like you to try to do this drawing freehand. I know we've been relying a lot on the rulers, but what I want to do is start to build those skills of drawing freehand. So I'm not expecting these to be perfectly, mechanical lines. I want it to feel like it's been drawn freehand. So I'm going to just randomly establish this is the front corner of my box. I'm not worried about a literal measurement yet, but once we get this drawn in, then we're going to be using this to compare other things. So this is going to be my unit of measurement. It's that front corner of the box. Now, what I like to do early on is figure out where all the verticals are in the drawing. So I want to have the vertical that's the edge of this flap. I want to have the vertical that is the other edge of the box. And once I get those in the right spot, then I can start worrying about all these angles that are connecting those vertical lines. If you've got a one-point perspective box, you could also draw in the horizontals, but in this drawing there are no horizontal lines at all that I can see. Everything that's moving away from us is going on an angle. So the only truly vertical or horizontals that I can find in this box are the upright verticals. So I'm going to rely on those the most because my eye is better at judging the verticals than it will be judging any of the other angles in this drawing. So I'm taking lots of measurements, and I'm going to first try to figure out where this other side of the box is. So I'm going to measure the box, and once I've marked off that measurement, I'm going to turn it. And what surprises me is the width of the box is almost exactly the same from this point of view as the height, which I would have thought it was even further out. See, I'd sketched it out a little bit further, but I'm going to go ahead and trust my measurement more than what my brain thinks it should look like. And to see if I can get this more or less straight up and down, I might just double check to see how close I am to the edge at any particular point and try to square those up a little bit. I'm pretty bad at judging vertical on my paper. All right, so that's where the far side of the box is. The flap's going to hang out beyond that, and we're going to have to trim it up at some point, but we don't know that angle yet, so don't worry about it. And then the other thing I want to know is where is this edge of the flap? And once I get the flap, then maybe I can judge the back corner of the box that's somewhere in between. So I'm going to take another measurement. And when I measure things that are, I try to keep my measurements perpendicular. So even though this flap is going off at an angle, because I don't know exactly what that angle is, it's kind of dangerous to measure on an angle, because if I'm measuring at the wrong angle, it really changes the distance between the verticals. So if you just measure straight across, even though that flap's not horizontal, really what I'm looking for is the distance between this edge of the flap and where it attaches to the box. So I can just measure straight across there, and I'll have fewer chances of making errors. So I'm going to measure the smaller distance first, the width of the flap, and then count off how many of those fit into the height. And it is almost exactly half of this distance. So if I kind of estimate, okay, what is half of that? And sometimes I'll take a guess and then check it. So that's a little bit too short, so I could move it down a tiny bit and see if that's any better. Yeah, that's pretty close to half. So I can just take one of these now. And again, I'm not worried about where this ends at the top and the bottom. I'm just trying to get the verticals in the right place relative to each other so that I can keep working here. Now from there, I want to start. I've gotten all the easy parts out of the way. So now the trick is trying to judge some of these angles. So I'm going to revert to either my L tool or a compass, or I'm sorry, not a compass, a protractor, or if you have some other tool you can use to find that angle. That's going to be, I'm going to work on this big angle first, and once I get that, then many of the other lines should be at a pretty similar angle to that. So another thing that some people will do is they think about this more like it's a grid in a math class, and you're looking at the difference between the rise and the run. So if you can, decide how far you need to measure over and then how far you need to measure up, that's another way that you can take those measurements. So you might just extend an imaginary line across and measure the distance between, where the back of the flap is versus the front of the flap. So whatever system works for you, there's lots and lots of ways that you can judge that angle accurately. I'm going to use the L tool, and again, make sure you're not pointing that L tool into space. You've got to keep it at a right angle to your line of sight. So imagine that it's up against a window, and then once you get that angle matched, so I'm lining up one edge with this line that I've just drawn, and I'm moving the L to try to judge this angle. So once I've, in real life with the real box, once I've got that, I pinch it tight together, and then I figure out where that corner needs to be, and right now I'm going to the corner is going to be right where that base of that line is going to be, and you can lay that right on, as long as this hasn't shifted, keep it kind of pinched tight until you get it down there, and then you mark, you might give yourself a couple landmarks, but do try to draw it freehand. I know it's tempting just to draw right along that, but I do want you to try to build the skills of drawing this freehand. So now, you might assume that this angle is going to be exactly the same as all these other angles, but if you do that, then it's going to seem like the box is never getting any smaller. It's just going to be almost like a mechanical drawing of the box that doesn't show depth. And so instead of just assuming that all these angles are going to be the same, I'm going to measure again. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to flip the L tool upside down, and in real life I'm going to try to match up this angle, and then I'll bring it down to my drawing. So okay, so I pinch that tight, line up the top, mark a couple spots where that needs to be, and then do your best, just freehand it. If you pivot from your elbow or your shoulder, it's easier to keep that line pretty straight. And I realize, okay, now I need to extend this up a little higher to meet that corner. Now, if we're doing this right, this part of the box is farther away from us in real life, so it should appear to be a little bit shorter. It's gonna vary depending on how big this box is that you're drawing. So if you're drawing a little tiny box like this, that's only 4 or 5 inches tall, you're not going to see as noticeable a difference in the measurement here at the front as you would in the back. But if it's a big box from Amazon that you just bought a winter coat in, that back part of the box is going to be 1.5 feet farther away from you than the front part is, and so there should be a measurable distance, a difference in the distances there. So you'll always look for the back side of the receding plane to be a little bit smaller than the side that's closest to us. All right, and then I also want to try to get the angle of this flap, so I could check the angle up here in real life, or if I want to do this angle, again, acute angles, ones that are less than 90 degrees, are sometimes a little harder to use with this tool than angles that are greater than 90 degrees. So I think I'm going to do the measuring here, and so I'll line that up, try not to block the camera. So it's a little bit greater than 90 degrees, not a whole lot. So I'm going to line that up with that top corner again. Mark it there, mark it here. And the other thing I can do is I can measure in real life, this edge of the flap and compare it to this edge of the flap and see if they are the same or if the back one's a tiny bit shorter. Yeah, it's a little bit shorter. So when I measure this one and compare it to this one, this back one should be a little bit smaller, but that flap's not that huge. Maybe it's just a 6-inch flap. So I won't see as much of a difference in foreshortening on this side as I would on this longer part of the box. All right, so now I'm kind of thinking in the back of my head, even though my vanishing points are way too far away to actually put in this drawing. I am kind of thinking, okay, these should eventually seem to be getting a little bit closer together. These should all be seeming to get a little bit closer together as they extend off this way. And then I also want to start getting some of these other angles in. So let's tackle this flap. Now I know this front edge of the flap should be heading to the same vanishing points that the top and the bottom of the box are. So that shouldn't be at a weird angle. Sometimes you might think it's horizontal because it seems to be sticking right out at us, but look for that to be at an angle that's somewhere in between the two extreme angles, the top and the bottom angle. So the other thing I'm thinking about is, you know, how far down should that flap go? So I'm going to be kind of comparing, for one thing, I'll look at this negative shape that happens where this kind of triangular shape is. That might help me kind of judge that angle. The other thing I might notice is, you know, if I were to measure, let's say, this distance below the flap and the distance including the flap, which is a greater distance, so I think I'll try that next. Yeah, it does seem like the flap, you know, if you're thinking about this whole distance, the flap comes down a little more than halfway. So let me just kind of check and see if that's a pretty close guess. Yeah, I'm going to keep it there. And I'm going to just try to maintain, you know, keep this line sort of the same proportions between the other lines. And we'll be fixing a lot of things as we go. The other thing I might notice is, well, how far does this flap extend out here? So here's a spot. I can just take a measurement and I can compare it to a distance I've already got here. So is this distance going to be greater, or is this distance going to be greater? So with a quick measurement, I can check that out. All right, it's definitely, this is a bigger measurement, so I know that this flap can't stick out any more than that distance. I'm going to shorten it a little bit. The other thing I could do is I could, you know, try a point out and then start thinking about this. Are these two planes now? At most they would be parallel. They'll never seem to be getting farther apart as they move away from us. If anything, they should be getting slightly closer together as they move off towards our vanishing point. So I think that angle looks fairly convincing. I'm going to go ahead and pencil that in for now, and we'll see if we need to change things as we go. Sometimes things just aren't looking right, and we'll fine-tune those angles. But we've already got, you know, some of this figured out. And then I want to figure out where this corner of the box is as well. So I feel like maybe my rough sketch is at too steep of an angle, so I'm going to go back and I'm going to try again with my L tool. I've already done the flap, but now I want to figure out what the angle of the box is. That's mostly hidden by that front flap. So try to keep my hand out of the way of the camera. All right, so it's just slightly greater angle. Again, align that corner again. And I can also look to see like how far above that flap. So I could notice like how far along this line that vertical line happens. It seems like it's not quite at the halfway mark, but maybe not quite as far over as I made it. So let's try maybe something like that. And then I'll use this to kind of help estimate that wedge. So I'm kind of looking at this little wedge like it's a piece of pie and checking to see if that looks pretty close to the way I'm seeing it there. It's not too bad. Now, this angle of the box and this back side of the box should be pretty similar. I'm going to check to see if that back one is quite as angled. It should probably be closer to a 90-degree angle because we're getting closer to our eye level back there. So I'm going to try this and see what it starts to look like. And if I do this right, if I extend this part of the box and this part of the box, they also should be converging, but at a more drastic rate than what happens on the flap, because the flap is on an inclined plane, so it's not going to converge until way, way above our vanishing point. But this one is at a shallower angle, it's getting nearer our vanishing point, so that convergence is going to be more noticeable. So I think this is okay. If I had drawn the angle like this, I would know it's wrong because there's no way they should ever be getting farther apart. But if anything, they should be at least parallel and hopefully converging somewhat. So I think that's not too far off. And then I want to try to figure out where this back corner is going to be. This is a little bit trickier because, again, I don't have any verticals or horizontals to base it off of. I could use the L tool here. The other thing I think I'll do is I'll try to plot out where the back corner of the box is. Even though most of that line is hidden, I can see enough of it that I could measure over from this edge and compare, you know, how far over to this edge it needs to be, and see if I can get that in the right spot. And then I could just extend that line straight up to help me double check where that corner is. So yeah, so it's about, I mean, this is assuming that I drew that flap in the right spot, but the distance from here to here seemed to be almost exactly the distance I needed to find that back corner. So I'm going to sketch it in lightly, and then I'm going to check a couple more things before I darken it in too much. So I could also compare this side of the box to this hidden side of the box. I can't see this part, but I'm imagining it just goes straight down from there. So I could kind of compare, you know, which one of these planes is bigger. And I'm thinking, yeah, they're really similar. So I could use this one as a starting point at least for how big that one needs to be. So I think I'm in the ballpark. Now this angle, because it's lower below our eye level, it's going to have to start slanting up a little bit sooner. So I'm trying to ignore this flap because that's not really part of the actual box itself, you know, as far as the basic rectangular form of the box. But I am paying attention to how this angle and this one, you know, the corners of the box, relate to this new one that I'm going to be drawing. So if that angle comes in at a really similar angle to this one, we're going to be doing pretty well. So we don't want it to get too flat. It needs to be still heading toward that same vanishing point. So I think I'm going to keep that angle, you know, fairly steep. And then I'll double check it with an L tool too. But it's an acute angle, so it's going to be a little harder to judge that angle. But I'll go ahead and see if I can figure that out. I'm trying to see the camera. Let's see. Yeah, I think we're pretty close. So let's keep it there for now. And then let's finish off the box. So even though we can't see where this back corner is, we know that this hidden part of the box is going to be heading to the same vanishing point that this line does, and this line does, and that line. So sometimes I'll just take a couple skewers to kind of estimate where that back corner might be. And then we know that the back bottom part of the box has to align with both of those lines, right? And I'm thinking about how that line should also relate to this line of the flap, since in real life all of those parts are heading to the same vanishing point. So I'm going to just make a couple marks for myself. I could also check here, you know, I can see where that line hits this front, my master line, and I could double check. It looks like it's hitting about 1/4 of the way up that line, and yeah, when I measure, that seems like that's pretty close. So I'll leave it there, draw it in, and again, for now, plot it out as if it's transparent, just to help you double check that all your angles are, oops, knocking my drawing around. All right, now this one, we've kind of figured out where this is going to be. We also want this line to feel like it's leading to the same vanishing point that this line and this line and this line and this line all are. So even though we're not actually leading to a true vanishing point, we're thinking about that in the back of our heads so that our box doesn't get too distorted. All right, so that's the basics of getting that box drawn. Now, if you want to make it a little bit more interesting, and if you're kind of excited about getting into a little bit of shading, we can add a little bit of hatching. So this is a totally optional part of it. My main concern on this drawing is that your angles are correct. So if you spend 2 hours and you just get to this point, I would be still very happy with your drawing if all of your angles are right. If you feel like you want to explore a little bit of shading, this is what I would suggest. So, oh, I forgot the flap on the bottom here. So with that flap, we know that it's laying flat down against the tabletop. So I'm just going to extend these lines. Like when we drew our flaps in perspective theory, those lines just came out like this. I don't know exactly where this corner is, but I'm going to use my skewer and drop an imaginary line straight down from another point that I already have drawn and figure out if this bottom corner is to the right or left of that landmark. And it looks like it's definitely slightly to the left of that point. But how far is the question? So I think another thing I could do is I could measure this distance against something else that I already have. Maybe I'll compare it to this one and just see if I can figure out how long that flap needs to be. So I'll compare a couple things. It appears a little shorter than this one, so it only comes down to about here. Let's try that, and then we'll check to see if we extend a line straight up from that. Okay, we're still a little bit to the left of that point, which it needs to be, looking at the real object. So I'm going to use that as my guide for now. And then this part of the flap, remember, also needs to be converging gradually with these other lines. And so I just don't want to make it too far off of those other angles. I could also measure this line to double check. I'm going to estimate it to be about here, and then I'll double check before I lock it in too much. So let's measure some distances and compare in real life, which, it looks real similar to some of those other ones. So let's see if that would work out. That seems a little longer than that or this. I'm going to just, they're pretty close, so I think I'll leave it right there. So for adding hatching and depth now, if you want to push this a little bit further, if you feel like you want to start moving into some shading, what you can do is think about the direction that that plane is traveling and try to add some hatching on that same orientation. And usually what I would do is, in real life, try to figure out which surface of this box is getting the most light. I think maybe this little tiny triangle is getting the most light. So even though it's a brown box, since that's the lightest plane, I'll just leave that the white of the paper. And we'll add a little bit of tone on the other areas. What I want you to do is move away from the idea that shading has to be smeary. So I know a lot of times high school art teachers might encourage you to like rub your fingers all over your graphite to blend it. I want you to have more control than that. I want you to use the lightweight hatching and use directional lines, almost like cross contours, to really make your graphite drawings nice and clean. We'll be doing plenty of smearing when we get to charcoal, so you'll get your fix for smearing if that's really what you like to do. But for graphite, I really like to keep it a little bit more clean, less kind of greasy, smeary stuff. So let's add a little bit of hatching. I won't do the whole thing, but I'll just kind of show you how we can push some of these planes back into the shadows a little bit more. So on these side planes, I like to follow, and I sometimes will turn my paper so it's oriented the way that my hand wants to move, and try to bring those lines right to the edge so it really feels like those shadows are tucking back underneath that plane. I'm using a pretty light touch. You might also, if you're using the kind of smudgy charcoal, you might want to put some sort of paper under your hand so that your hand's not picking up all the graphite here. I'd like to assign a different value, even though all this feels really dark in here, I'd like you to assign a slightly different darkness to each one of those planes to help the viewer understand it a little bit better. So in the real life box, these all seem about equally dark, but I'm going to make maybe the back wall a tiny bit darker when I'm hatching than the others so that it stands out a little bit more clearly. And the closer you put those lines together, the less it's going to look like big stripes, and the more it will just look like shadow. So you can go one direction, and then if you want it to feel even more like there's a plane change, you can, like on the side plane, I'm going to add hatching following the direction of that plane. And if you want to go even a little bit darker to try to, you can add additional hatching in between, or press a little bit harder, or switch to a slightly softer pencil. But the softer the pencil, the more likely it is to start getting muddy looking and smudgy. So I prefer to just put a lot more lines closer together and still use a fairly hard pencil. This is a number 2, just you know, a HB pencil, but you can get quite a bit of nice hatching using an even harder pencil there. So, and then you know, if you want to do something like see this cast shadow that's coming across here, you might figure out, okay, well, where does that hit? And you might add a little bit of shading there. I'm going to just continue that into the box since it's also in shadow. But I am thinking about what angle this plane of the box is lying on so that the shading reinforces that sense of volume. And maybe up here, I'm going to make this hatching spread out a little bit as we get farther down into the box so that more light seems to be penetrating that bottom part. I also like the flaps to feel like they're at a little bit different angle than the vertical or the top plane of the box. So you might do just a little bit of hatching there. I'm kind of doing this quickly so we don't take too long with the video. And then, you know, this plane might also have a little bit of shading that separates it from the plane that's behind it. Okay, so you can do more if you want to, but when you're done, I would like you to take your kneaded eraser, try to clean up any places where you've started to get real smudgy, and if you can kind of refine your lines a little bit, try to lock into one precise line rather than a whole lot of real sketchy lines. Erase some of the extra lines that are in there. All right. That looks good. And then you might also, if you can see this, you know, there might be a line that you put in if it's on a table. You can keep that more faint, but think about like where it would actually run. Both sides there. Okay, that's what I'm looking for is drawn from life, drawn freehand if you can. Try to resist the urge to trace everything with your ruler. Try to build the skill of drawing independently. And I will be looking for things, you know, even whether you leave these dotted lines or not, I will be thinking, okay, the hidden parts of the box, are they still making sense with the visible parts that we can see? So do originally construct it as if you could see through it, and then if you decide you want to erase those dotted lines to make it look more realistic, you can do that, but don't ignore the transparent aspect when you're doing the constructions. All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you.